By the time victory in World War II became unavoidable, the machinery of war did not slow down. It shifted. For the people inside the system, winning did not immediately feel like resolution. It felt like transition into a new and unfamiliar phase, one defined by uncertainty rather than relief. Military institutions are designed to fight wars, not to stop them cleanly. They are built around continuity, readiness, and forward momentum. When victory approached, these systems did not dissolve. They remained active, carrying forward habits, structures, and assumptions formed under years of pressure. As a result, the end of fighting did not automatically produce clarity or stability. For soldiers, the experience was disorienting. The routines that had governed daily life suddenly lost their purpose, but nothing replaced them immediately. Units still existed, orders still arrived, responsibilities remained, even as the reason for enduring them began to change. Victory removed one source of danger, but introduced a different kind of uncertainty. At higher levels, commanders faced problems that had been secondary during combat. Occupation, demobilization, logistics of return, and political transition became urgent without having been fully tested. Planning for these challenges had existed, but it had never been the primary focus. Winning the war did not answer the question of what came next. It exposed it. Psychologically, the shift was difficult. For years, effort had been justified by necessity. Sacrifice had a clear frame. When that frame disappeared, meaning became harder to define. Victory did not arrive as a moment of completion. It arrived as the beginning of unresolved consequences. This documentary examines why the end of World War II did not bring immediate closure, and how victory itself created new problems for those who had fought, commanded, and planned the war. It explores how systems built for conflict struggled with success, and why the aftermath felt uncertain, even in triumph. Understanding this phase is essential to understanding how wars truly end. Not when fighting stops, but when institutions, expectations, and lives are forced to adapt to a reality they were never designed to face. Victory did not arrive as a clean break from the war. For those inside the system, it emerged gradually and unevenly, creating problems that had been postponed rather than solved. Military institutions that had been optimized for sustained conflict now faced a task they were not designed to handle smoothly: transition. The end of fighting removed one set of pressures, but immediately exposed others that had been held in check by necessity. Throughout the war, decision-making had been guided by a single overriding priority: defeat the enemy. This priority simplified choices. Resources were allocated with urgency, authority was centralized, and delay was tolerated only when unavoidable. As victory approached, that clarity dissolved. New questions surfaced that did not have immediate answers. How quickly should forces be reduced? Which units should remain in place? How should occupied territories be governed? None of these problems had the same procedural clarity as combat operations. For soldiers, the shift was confusing. Daily life had been structured around preparation, readiness, and survival. Even in quiet periods, routines existed for a clear reason. When victory became imminent, those routines lost their urgency without disappearing. Units remained assembled. Equipment still had to be maintained. Orders continued to arrive, but their purpose was less clear. The war was ending, yet the environment still felt like war. This ambiguity affected morale. Relief existed, but it was restrained. Many soldiers did not immediately experience victory as freedom. They experienced it as suspension. The danger of combat receded, but uncertainty about the future took its place. Questions about redeployment, occupation duty, and return home replaced earlier fears. The emotional release associated with victory was delayed by the absence of clear resolution. At higher levels, commanders faced similar uncertainty. Planning shifted from defeating an enemy to managing the consequences of success. Occupation required restraint rather than aggression. Demobilization required coordination rather than expansion. These tasks demanded different skills and assumptions. Systems built to move forward now had to slow down, reorganize, and in some cases, reverse direction. This transition was not immediate, because it could not be. The scale of the war meant that millions of people, vast quantities of equipment, and entire administrative structures could not simply be turned off. Victory removed the justification for continued fighting, but it did not remove the complexity created by years of mobilization. As a result, the first stage of victory was not closure, it was adjustment. The war had shaped institutions and expectations around endurance and continuation. Ending it required a different kind of effort, one that revealed how deeply conflict had structured daily life. Understanding why victory created new problems begins with recognizing this moment of transition. The war did not end with a single decision or announcement. It entered a phase where success itself became a challenge to manage. One of the most immediate problems created by victory was the question of scale. World War II had mobilized millions of soldiers and produced an enormous military infrastructure. When fighting stopped, that scale did not automatically disappear. Armies remained in place, supply systems continued to function, and administrative structures stayed active because there was no mechanism for instant reversal. Demobilization was often imagined as a simple process of sending soldiers home. In reality, it was complex and uneven. Decisions had to be made about who would leave first, which units would remain for occupation or security, and how equipment would be redistributed or disposed of. These decisions were not purely administrative. They affected morale, discipline, and political stability. For soldiers, this uncertainty was deeply personal. Many had expected victory to mean immediate return to civilian life. Instead, they encountered waiting of a different kind. Units were reassigned to occupation duties or held in staging areas while plans were finalized. The danger of combat was reduced, but the absence of clarity created frustration. Victory felt delayed. This delay altered how success was experienced. The war had provided a clear structure and purpose. With its end, that structure loosened without vanishing. Soldiers remained under military authority, performing tasks that no longer felt directly connected to survival or necessity. Maintaining discipline in this environment required different leadership than maintaining it under fire. Occupation duties introduced further complications. Soldiers trained for combat were now expected to enforce order, manage civilians, and represent authority in defeated territories. This role demanded restraint, patience, and judgment rather than aggression. The shift was difficult and often uncomfortable. Victory did not end responsibility, it transformed it. At the institutional level, victory created conflicting pressures. There was urgency to reduce forces and costs, but also a need to maintain stability and security. These goals competed. Rapid demobilization risked disorder, while prolonged occupation risked resentment and fatigue. Navigating this balance required decisions without clear precedent. Logistical challenges compounded these problems. Moving men and equipment home required time, transport, and coordination across continents. Infrastructure damaged by war limited capacity. Supply systems, designed to move resources toward the front, now had to reverse direction. This reversal was slower and more complicated than expected. Psychologically, this phase was disorienting. Soldiers who had endured years of danger now faced uncertainty without urgency. The emotional framework that had sustained them no longer applied. Victory had removed the enemy, but it had not provided immediate resolution. This explains why the first experience of victory often felt anticlimactic. The war ended, but its consequences remained active. For those inside the system, success introduced a new set of problems that required patience rather than endurance. Victory, in practice, was not an endpoint. It was the beginning of a different and often unexpected challenge. Victory also exposed problems of identity and purpose that had been suppressed during the war. For years, roles had been clearly defined. Soldiers fought, officers commanded, and institutions existed to sustain combat. Success removed the central organizing principle around which these identities had formed. What replaced it was uncertain and unevenly defined. For individual soldiers, this loss of clarity was immediate. Military life had imposed structure on every aspect of the day. Decisions were made within a clear hierarchy. Purpose was reinforced by necessity. With victory, that necessity weakened. Soldiers were still required to follow orders, but the meaning behind those orders changed. Tasks felt less urgent, and motivation became harder to sustain. This shift affected discipline. In combat, discipline is enforced by danger. Mistakes carry immediate consequences. In the aftermath of victory, consequences became less visible. Maintaining standards required internal motivation rather than external pressure. Commanders had to adjust their approach, emphasizing responsibility and professionalism instead of survival. At the institutional level, armies faced a similar challenge. Organizations built for war are defined by action. Their legitimacy rests on effectiveness in conflict. When conflict ends, that legitimacy must be redefined. Occupation, administration, and demobilization did not carry the same clarity or prestige as combat operations, yet they required equal attention. The psychological impact of this transition was significant. Soldiers who had endured hardship with a clear objective now faced ambiguity. Relief coexisted with restlessness. The war had been exhausting, but it had also provided meaning. Victory removed the struggle without immediately providing a replacement narrative. This tension surfaced in everyday behavior. Some soldiers became disengaged, while others clung to routines that had lost their original purpose. Informal discipline filled gaps left by formal structures. Units relied on habit to maintain cohesion in the absence of urgency. Commanders recognized these risks, but had limited tools to address them. Training for combat did not prepare leaders for managing victory. The skills required were different. Patience, communication, and restraint mattered more than decisiveness or aggression. Adjusting to this new environment took time. Victory also forced institutions to confront political realities that had been secondary during the war. Relations with civilian populations, allied coordination, and post-war planning demanded attention. Military authority now intersected more visibly with political responsibility. Decisions carried implications beyond the battlefield. For many, this phase felt more difficult than expected. The war had taught endurance. It had not taught how to stop. Victory required letting go of habits that had ensured survival. That process was uncomfortable and uncertain. Understanding this aspect of victory reveals why success did not immediately produce stability. Ending a war involves more than defeating an enemy. It requires redefining purpose for people and institutions shaped by conflict. That redefinition was neither quick nor simple. Victory solved one problem. It revealed several others that had been postponed by the demands of war. Victory also exposed economic and administrative pressures that had been masked by the urgency of war. During the conflict, inefficiency was tolerated if it supported momentum. Resources were allocated rapidly, costs were deferred, and shortages were managed through prioritization rather than balance. When fighting ended, these practices became liabilities that required immediate correction. Governments faced the task of shifting from total war economies to peacetime systems without causing disruption. Factories that had produced weapons and equipment needed to convert or shut down. Millions of workers had to be absorbed back into civilian industries. This transition could not occur overnight. The scale of mobilization meant that any abrupt change risked unemployment, inflation, or shortages. For soldiers, these economic realities translated into uncertainty about the future. Returning home did not guarantee stability. Jobs were not immediately available everywhere. Housing was limited, and communities had changed during years of absence. Victory ended military danger, but it did not restore the world soldiers had left behind. Administratively, the burden was immense. Records had to be processed, benefits calculated, and transportation coordinated for millions of individuals. These tasks lacked the clarity of military objectives. Errors and delays were inevitable. Frustration grew as expectations of quick resolution collided with bureaucratic reality. Occupation added another layer of complexity. Military authorities became responsible for managing defeated societies, maintaining order, and preventing collapse. These responsibilities demanded coordination with civilian agencies and allied governments. The line between military and political decision-making blurred. Victory expanded responsibility rather than reducing it. This expansion affected morale and perception. Soldiers who had expected their role to diminish found it transformed. Authority continued, but its purpose shifted. Enforcing rules, supervising reconstruction, and interacting with civilian populations required restraint and judgment. These tasks carried weight, but not the clarity of combat. Institutions also faced internal tension. Pressure to demobilize competed with the need to maintain control. Reducing forces too quickly risked instability. Maintaining them too long risked fatigue and resentment. There was no optimal solution, only trade-offs managed under imperfect conditions. Psychologically, this phase challenged assumptions about victory itself. Success had been imagined as relief and closure. Instead, it brought responsibility and complexity. The absence of an enemy did not simplify decisions. It complicated them by removing the framework that had guided action. This period reveals why victory cannot be understood as an endpoint. It is a transition that exposes unresolved problems accumulated during war. Economic strain, administrative burden, and social disruption do not disappear with the last battle. They surface immediately. Understanding this helps explain why the aftermath of World War II felt demanding even in triumph. The war ended, but the work did not. Victory replaced one set of pressures with another, requiring adaptation rather than celebration. Victory also forced a confrontation with the human cost of the war in ways that combat itself had often postponed. During fighting, loss was continuous and absorbed into routine. Casualties were processed, units rebuilt, and operations continued. When the war ended, that forward momentum stopped. What remained were absences that could no longer be explained by necessity or urgency. For many soldiers, this was the first moment when loss became fully visible. Friends who had not returned were no longer part of an ongoing struggle. Their absence was no longer temporary or contextual. It was final. During the war, grief had been managed through continuation. After victory, continuation slowed, and reflection filled the space it left behind. This shift was psychologically difficult. The structure of war had limited time for processing loss. Survival required focus on the present. Victory removed that constraint. Soldiers now had time to think about what had happened and what it had cost. For some, this brought relief. For others, it brought delayed grief that had no clear outlet. Institutions were not well prepared to manage this transition. Military systems excel at sustaining effort under pressure. They are less effective at addressing emotional consequences once pressure is removed. Demobilization procedures focused on logistics and administration, not on psychological adjustment. Many individuals were expected to reintegrate quickly, carrying experiences that had not yet been fully understood. This gap affected how victory was experienced collectively. Public celebration emphasized success and relief. For those returning from the war, that narrative did not always align with internal reality. The war had ended, but its effects persisted. The contrast between public optimism and private processing created distance rather than closure. The sense of unfinished business extended beyond individual experience. Questions about responsibility, sacrifice, and meaning remained unresolved. Why certain losses occurred when they did, or whether they could have been avoided, became subjects of reflection only after the war stopped demanding attention elsewhere. Victory created space for these questions, but not immediate answers. This dynamic explains why the aftermath of victory was not uniformly celebratory. Relief coexisted with unease. The end of fighting removed danger, but it also removed distraction. What remained were memories and consequences that had been deferred rather than resolved. Victory, in this sense, did not close the war for those who had lived it. It changed the conditions under which the war was remembered and processed. The absence of combat allowed its weight to be felt more clearly. Understanding this aspect of victory reveals another reason why success created new problems. Ending the war exposed costs that had been carried forward without pause. Once that movement stopped, the burden did not disappear. It became visible. Victory ended the fighting. It did not end the war's impact on the people who had endured it. Victory also created strategic uncertainty rather than immediate stability. With the enemy defeated, assumptions that had guided wartime decision-making no longer applied. Yet no clear framework replaced them. Military planners and political leaders now faced a world reshaped by the war, but without agreed answers on how power should be used or restrained in its aftermath. During the conflict, objectives had been defined by necessity: defeat the enemy, secure territory, maintain momentum. After victory, those objectives dissolved. New questions emerged quickly. How long should military forces remain deployed? How much authority should occupation governments exercise? How should former enemies be reintegrated without creating future instability? These were not operational problems. They were strategic and political problems, and they lacked clear doctrine. For military institutions, this transition was uncomfortable. Command structures were accustomed to decisive action under clear rules. Post-war responsibilities demanded caution, negotiation, and long-term thinking. The tools that had worked in combat were not always suitable for managing peace. This mismatch produced hesitation and disagreement rather than confidence. Soldiers experienced this uncertainty directly. Many remained deployed without a clear sense of mission beyond maintaining order. The absence of a defined enemy made authority harder to justify and discipline harder to enforce. Victory had removed the framework that explained why sacrifices were necessary. What remained was responsibility without clarity. Allied coordination further complicated matters. Wartime cooperation had been driven by shared necessity. With that necessity gone, differences in priorities became more visible. Political objectives diverged. Decisions about borders, governance, and influence required negotiation rather than command. Military forces became instruments of policy in ways they had not been during active combat. This shift affected morale. Soldiers and officers alike sensed that the purpose of their presence had changed, but they did not always understand how. The clarity of wartime roles gave way to ambiguity. Success had removed the enemy, but it had not removed tension. In some cases, it created new forms of it. Strategically, victory marked the beginning of a new contest rather than a period of rest. Power vacuums emerged. Former allies reassessed relationships. Military planners began preparing for contingencies that had been unthinkable during the war. The end of one conflict revealed the outlines of another. This reality explains why victory did not feel final. It closed one chapter, but opened several others. The war had provided structure through opposition. Peace required structure through agreement, and agreement was harder to achieve. Victory ended fighting, but it did not resolve uncertainty. It transformed it. The problems created by success were not failures of planning. They were the inevitable result of moving from a world defined by necessity to one defined by choice. As the immediate demands of war faded, another problem became clear. Victory did not produce a shared sense of direction. During the conflict, disagreement could be postponed because survival required alignment. After victory, that pressure disappeared. Differences in goals, priorities, and expectations surfaced quickly, both within institutions and among allies. Military organizations felt this shift internally. Wartime authority had been centralized and unquestioned. Orders were followed because the stakes were clear. In the aftermath, authority remained, but its justification weakened. Decisions now involved judgment rather than urgency. This change created friction between levels of command and between military and civilian leadership. Victory required coordination in an environment no longer governed by emergency. For soldiers, this translated into ambiguity. Many remained deployed, performing duties that felt disconnected from the effort that had defined their service. Maintaining order, supervising transitions, and waiting for redeployment lacked the clarity of combat missions. The absence of a defined endpoint made patience harder to sustain. Victory had removed danger, but it had not removed obligation. Public perception added to this tension. At home, the war was increasingly understood as finished. Expectations shifted toward return and normalcy. For those still in uniform, reality lagged behind that narrative. Delays in demobilization and redeployment created a gap between public expectation and personal experience. Victory, as understood by civilians, did not match victory as lived by soldiers. This gap affected morale. The war had justified sacrifice through necessity. After victory, that justification weakened. Soldiers were asked to continue serving without the same explanation. Some adapted, others grew frustrated. Leadership had to manage these reactions without the tools that wartime urgency had provided. Institutionally, this period required redefining success. Winning battles was no longer the measure. Stability, compliance, and restraint became priorities. These outcomes were harder to quantify and slower to achieve. They offered less immediate feedback, making progress difficult to assess. Victory removed clear metrics without replacing them. The result was a period of adjustment, marked by uncertainty rather than celebration. The war had ended, but its structures persisted. People were still moving, waiting, and deciding within systems built for conflict. Transition required dismantling those systems carefully, not abandoning them abruptly. This explains why victory did not feel complete when it occurred. It initiated a phase that demanded patience, compromise, and restraint. The end of fighting did not resolve tension. It redistributed it. Victory, in practice, was not a moment. It was a process, and processes rarely feel finished while they are still underway. Victory ultimately revealed a final and deeper problem. Wars end faster on paper than they do in human experience. The formal conclusion of World War II resolved military opposition, but it did not instantly undo the habits, structures, and expectations built over years of conflict. For those who had lived inside the war, the end did not feel like completion. It felt like dislocation. The systems that had sustained the war did not disappear when fighting stopped. Military hierarchies, logistical networks, and administrative routines continue to operate because they had to. Millions of people could not be released, relocated, or reintegrated at once. Victory halted combat, but it left behind a world still organized around war. For soldiers, this meant that the war ended unevenly. Some returned home quickly, others remained deployed for months or years. The meaning of victory varied depending on where one stood within the system. There was no single experience of the end, only a series of transitions that unfolded at different speeds. Psychologically, this fragmentation mattered. The war had demanded constant focus and adaptation.
Ending it required a different kind of adjustment, one that was slower and less defined. Relief existed, but it was mixed with uncertainty, fatigue, and unresolved questions. Many had prepared themselves to endure longer. Letting go of that readiness was not immediate. Institutions faced a similar challenge. Military organizations had been built to continue until stopped by force. Stopping voluntarily required dismantling authority, redistributing responsibility, and redefining purpose. These changes could not be improvised. They required negotiation, planning, and time. Victory exposed how little preparation had been made for peace compared to war. This does not mean victory failed. It means victory was incomplete by design. War simplifies priorities. Peace complicates them. The problems revealed by success were not mistakes. They were the natural result of ending a system built around necessity and replacing it with one built around choice. Only with distance did the war acquire a clear ending. For those who lived through it, that clarity came later. At the moment of victory, what existed was transition, not closure. The fighting had stopped, but the consequences were still unfolding. Understanding this resolves a common misunderstanding. Victory did not end the war's impact. It transformed it. The war concluded as a military event, but it continued as a human and institutional process. In that sense, victory did not close the story of World War II. It opened its final chapter.